They called her too chunky for love, but Eleanor Hartwell carried more strength in her generous frame than most men possessed in their entire beings. The September sun beat mercilessly against the wooden platform of Copper Ridge Station, where dust devils danced between the scattered luggage of disappointed dreams. Eleanor stood perfectly still beside her worn leather trunk, her cornflower blue dress clinging to her fuller figure in the oppressive heat. While the man who was supposed to become her husband looked her up and down with the cold calculation of a cattle buyer examining inferior stock. "This ain't what was promised," Samuel Garrett announced loud enough for half the platform to hear, his voice cutting through the desert air like a rusty blade. "The advertisement said a woman of fine proportions, not someone who'd eat me out of house and home before winter's end." His laughter joined the cruel chuckles of the gathered townspeople, turning Eleanor's cheeks the same shade as the setting sun that painted the surrounding mesas in shades of humiliation. The train's whistle echoed across the valley as it pulled away, taking with it Eleanor's last connection to the Boston life she'd left behind. She watched the black smoke dissipate into the endless sky, carrying away not just the locomotive but her final thread of retreat. The weight of every stair pressed against her shoulders like stones in a sack, but she kept her chin level with the horizon, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. Samuel Garrett mounted his horse with theatrical flourish, leaving Eleanor standing among the tumbleweeds of broken promises. "Find yourself another fool," he called over his shoulder, spurring his mare toward town. "This one's got standards." The remaining spectators dispersed like crows from a scarecrow, their whispered conversations trailing behind them like dust from wagon wheels. Eleanor remained motionless for long minutes after the platform emptied, listening to the wind sing its lonely song through the telegraph wires overhead. The sound reminded her of her grandmother's rocking chair back in Massachusetts, creaking out a rhythm of comfort that seemed impossible to find in this harsh landscape of judgment and rejection. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, tasting alkali dust and sage on her tongue, forcing herself to find beauty even in this moment of complete abandonment. The sun had begun its descent toward the jagged mountain peaks when Eleanor finally picked up her carpetbag and approached the stationmaster's window. Old Pete Jenkins peered at her through wire-rimmed spectacles, his weathered face softening with something resembling sympathy. "Mrs. Hartwell, ain't it? Heard what happened with Garrett. Can't say I'm surprised. That man's got about as much heart as a sidewinder." "Miss Hartwell," Eleanor corrected gently, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I suppose I'll be needing directions to a boarding house, if you'd be so kind." She reached into her reticule and counted her remaining coins, calculating quickly how long her modest savings might sustain her in this unforgiving place. Pete scratched his graying beard and glanced toward the town's main street, where lamplights were beginning to flicker to life like hesitant stars. "Well now, that might be a problem. Mrs. Henderson runs the only respectable place for ladies, and she's particular about her clientele. Might be worth a try, though she's been known to turn folks away for less cause than." He caught himself before finishing the unkind observation, but Eleanor understood the unspoken words perfectly. The walk into Copper Ridge felt like a journey through a gauntlet of curious eyes and whispered assessments. Eleanor's sturdy boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each determined step, and she found herself focusing on the rhythm of her footfalls rather than the weight of unwelcome attention. The town sprawled before her like a collection of wooden boxes scattered by a careless child, most buildings leaning slightly as if tired from the constant battle against wind and weather. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house stood 2 stories tall at the end of Main Street, its white paint peeling like old skin in the relentless sun. Eleanor climbed the front steps with careful dignity, each board creaking a warning beneath her feet. The elderly proprietress answered her knock with pursed lips and appraising eyes that traveled from Eleanor's unpinned auburn hair to her practical brown boots. "We're full up," Mrs. Henderson announced without preamble, though Eleanor could see vacant rooms through the lace-curtained windows behind her. "Try the saloon. They might have something in the back." The door closed with finality that echoed like a gunshot in the evening air. Eleanor stood on the porch for several heartbeats, watching the purple shadows lengthen across the dusty street. A part of her wanted to crumple like newspaper in flame, to surrender to the crushing weight of repeated rejection. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and walked back down the steps, her spine as rigid as the fence posts that lined the town's perimeter. The Golden Nugget Saloon squatted at the opposite end of Main Street like a toad in the gathering darkness, its batwing doors releasing bursts of raucous laughter and piano music into the cooling air. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, knowing the implications of a respectable woman seeking shelter in such a place, but the alternatives seemed even bleaker than damaged reputation. Big Jim McKenzie, the saloon keeper, proved surprisingly kind despite his intimidating bulk and elaborate mustache. "Now don't you worry, miss," he assured her, leading her to a small but clean room above the establishment. "This here's separate from the main business, and I keep a strict policy about bothering my tenants. You'll be safe as Sunday morning, long as you can tolerate some noise from downstairs." The room contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the alley behind the building. Eleanor sat on the thin mattress and finally allowed herself a moment of private grief, tears falling silently onto her folded hands. Through the floorboards beneath her feet, She could hear the celebration of men who had never known the particular loneliness of being unwanted before they'd even had a chance to prove their worth. But Eleanor Hartwell had not traveled 1,500 miles to surrender to self-pity. As the night deepened around her modest sanctuary, she began to plan. Her fingers traced the edge of her grandmother's cameo brooch, the one piece of jewelry she'd been unable to sell before making this journey west. The old woman's face seemed to look back at her from the clouded mirror above the washstand, reminding her that strength often came disguised as softness, and that the most nourishing meals were prepared by hands that understood both hunger and abundance. Morning arrived with the harsh beauty of desert sunrise, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that made even the ramshackle buildings of Copper Ridge appear touched by divine artistry. Eleanor dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a sensible gray cotton that made her figure appear more modest, and pinned her thick hair into a neat chignon that suggested competence rather than vanity. Her first stop was Murphy's General Store, where she hoped to find employment that might sustain her while she considered her limited options. The proprietor, a thin man with nervous hands and kind eyes, listened to her request with obvious discomfort. "I'd surely like to help, miss, but my wife does all the bookkeeping and customer service. Can't afford to pay another salary, what with the drought affecting everyone's business." Eleanor thanked him politely and moved on to the next establishment, then the next, receiving variations of the same apologetic rejection. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to make her gray dress feel like a woolen prison, and her optimism had begun to fray at the edges like an overused rope. She was resting in the meager shade beside the feed store when she first noticed the man on horseback at the edge of town. He sat motionless astride a paint mare, his silhouette dark against the shimmering heat waves that rose from the desert floor. Even from a distance, Eleanor could sense something different about him, a stillness that spoke of deep waters rather than emptiness, patience rather than indifference. Thomas Mitchell had been watching the town's treatment of the newcomer with growing disgust. He witnessed Samuel Garrett's public humiliation of her at the train station, seen her dignified response to cruelty that would have sent lesser souls fleeing back east on the next locomotive. Something about her quiet strength reminded him of his late wife Sarah, who had possessed the same ability to find grace in the midst of hardship. As the afternoon wore toward evening, Thomas watched Eleanor emerge from another failed interview, her shoulders set with determination despite the obvious toll of repeated rejection. She paused beside the town well and used her handkerchief to wipe dust from her face, the gesture so unconsciously elegant that it stirred something in his chest that had been dormant for 3 long years. Eleanor became aware of the watcher as she prepared to return to her room above the saloon. She looked across the street and met his gaze directly, neither challenging nor retreating from the contact. In that moment of mutual recognition, something passed between them that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with the language of souls that have learned to endure solitude. Thomas touched the brim of his hat in respectful acknowledgement before turning his horse toward home. The gesture was simple, but Eleanor found herself thinking about it long after he disappeared into the gathering dusk. It had been weeks since anyone had shown her even basic courtesy, and the unexpected kindness settled in her chest like warmth from a well-ended fire. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Doc Brennan burst through the saloon doors just after sunrise, his usually composed demeanor fractured by urgency. "Jim, we've got trouble. The Henderson place caught fire in the night, family's safe, but they've lost everything. Mrs. Henderson's asking for help organizing relief efforts, but half the town's women are too busy gossiping to lend a hand." Eleanor was descending the stairs for breakfast when she heard the commotion. Without hesitation, she approached the group of concerned men. "Gentlemen, if you'll pardon the interruption, I'd like to help with the relief efforts. I have experience organizing charitable work back in Boston." The men exchanged glances that mixed surprise with skepticism. Big Jim cleared his throat diplomatically. "That's mighty kind of you, Miss Hartwell, but the ladies of the town usually handle such matters through their church auxiliary." "The same ladies who are apparently too occupied with gossip to respond to a neighbor's crisis?" Eleanor's voice remained gentle, but her words carried steel beneath the silk. "I believe Christian charity should transcend social hierarchies, don't you?" Doc Brennan, a practical man who valued action over social niceties, nodded approvingly. "She's got a point, boys. If she's willing to help, I say we accept. The Henderson family needs assistance more than they need social protocols." Eleanor spent the morning coordinating relief efforts with an efficiency that gradually earned grudging respect from even the most skeptical townspeople. She organized food donations, arranged temporary shelter, and somehow convinced the competing merchant families to pool their resources despite long-standing business rivalries. Her ability to see past personal grievances to focus on genuine need impressed everyone who witnessed her work. It was during these relief efforts that Thomas Mitchell appeared at her elbow like a shadow given substance. He carried a crate of preserved goods from his ranch, setting it down beside the growing collection of donated supplies. "Miss Hartwell," he said quietly, his voice carrying the slight roughness of a man unaccustomed to frequent conversation. "Thomas Mitchell, I wanted to contribute to your efforts." Eleanor looked up from her list of donations and found herself studying a face that told stories of both hardship and character. Thomas stood tall but not imposing, his dark hair showing threads of silver at the temples, his brown eyes holding depths that suggested thoughtfulness rather than judgment. His work clothes were clean but worn, speaking of a man who understood the value of both dignity and practicality. "Mr. Mitchell," she replied, extending her hand in a gesture that caused several onlookers to raise their eyebrows at her boldness. "Your contribution is most welcome, and your timing is providential. I was just wondering how we might transport supplies to families living outside of town." Thomas accepted her handshake with a slight smile that transformed his serious features. "I'd be honored to help with transportation. My wagon's sturdy, and I know every family within 20 miles of here." His grip was firm but gentle, calloused from honest work but respectful of her smaller hands. They worked together throughout the afternoon, and Eleanor found herself appreciating Thomas's quiet competence and thoughtful approach to problems. Unlike the men in town who seemed to equate volume with authority, Thomas spoke only when he had something meaningful to contribute, and his suggestions invariably proved both practical and considerate. As they loaded the last of the supplies into his wagon, Thomas glanced toward the setting sun and then back at Eleanor. "Miss Hartwell, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I've been considering your situation. I know the town hasn't exactly welcomed you with open arms." Eleanor's cheeks colored slightly, but she met his gaze steadily. "I'm afraid my situation has become rather obvious to everyone, Mr. Mitchell. I appreciate whatever counsel you might offer." Thomas removed his hat and turned it slowly in his hands, a gesture Eleanor was beginning to recognize as his way of choosing words carefully. "My ranch is about 5 miles north of town. It's not much to look at, and I'll admit it's been going to seed since my wife passed 3 years back. I've been managing alone, but the truth is, I'm failing at it." Eleanor waited patiently while he gathered his thoughts, sensing that whatever he was about to propose would be significant for both of them. "I need help managing the household side of the ranch, cooking, organizing, keeping books, that sort of thing. It wouldn't be charity, mind you. I'd pay fair wages and provide separate quarters. Completely respectable arrangement." He met her eyes directly. "I've watched you work today, and I can see you understand how to manage things properly. If you're interested, the position is yours." The offer hung in the air between them like morning mist over still water, fragile and potentially transformative. Eleanor felt her heart begin to beat more rapidly, not just from relief at the prospect of honest employment, but from something deeper, the recognition that this man saw her as capable rather than burdensome, valuable rather than unwanted. "Mr. Mitchell," she said carefully, "I'm grateful for your offer, and I accept with appreciation. When would you like me to begin?" "Tomorrow morning, if that suits you. I'll come by with the wagon to collect you and your belongings." Thomas replaced his hat and touched the brim in his characteristic gesture of respect. "Miss Hartwell, I want you to know, this arrangement is based on your demonstrated abilities, not on charity or pity. I hope that's clear." Eleanor felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen for the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge. "That's very clear, Mr. Mitchell, and very much appreciated. I look forward to being useful again." As Thomas drove away in his loaded wagon, Eleanor remained standing in the dusty street, watching his silhouette disappear into the purple shadows of approaching night. For the first time in weeks, she felt the stirring of genuine hope rather than mere determination to survive. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn air that made even the desert seem touched by magic. Eleanor packed her few belongings carefully, folding each garment with the precision of someone who understood the value of taking care of what little they possessed. As she prepared to leave the room above the saloon, she realized she was not the same woman who had arrived in Copper Ridge just days before. Rejection had not broken her spirit, but had instead refined it, burning away self-doubt to reveal the strength that had always lived beneath her gentle exterior. Thomas arrived precisely when he'd promised, his wagon cleaned and his manner quietly courteous. He loaded her trunk and carpetbag without comment about their modest size, understanding intuitively that dignity mattered more than possessions to someone who had learned to live with less. The ride to the Mitchell Ranch took them through landscape that gradually revealed its subtle beauty to eyes willing to look beyond first impressions. Eleanor found herself appreciating the way morning light caught the silver green of sagebrush, how the distant mountains seemed to change color with each shift of the sun's angle. Thomas proved to be a comfortable traveling companion, pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of local history without overwhelming her with conversation. "That's Eagle Rock," he said, indicating a formation that did indeed resemble a massive bird in flight. "The Navajo have stories about it, say it marks a place where earth touches sky. My wife Sarah always said she could feel something special there." His voice carried sadness but not bitterness when he spoke of his late wife, and Eleanor sensed that his grief had mellowed into something more like grateful remembrance. The Mitchell Ranch appeared gradually as they crested a low hill, revealing buildings that spoke of good intentions and gradual decline. The main house stood sturdy but weathered, its front porch sagging slightly under the weight of neglect. Outbuildings dotted the property like scattered thoughts, some in better repair than others, all bearing witness to the challenge of maintaining a ranch alone. Eleanor studied the scene with practical eyes, already cataloging tasks and prioritizing improvements. She could see past the current state of disrepair to the bones of what had once been a thriving homestead. The location was beautiful, sheltered by cottonwoods that followed a seasonal creek, with good sight lines and natural windbreaks that showed someone had chosen the spot with care. I know it doesn't look like much right now, Thomas said, his voice carrying a note of apology as he helped her down from the wagon. Sarah kept everything running smooth, and I've been stumbling along trying to manage both ranch work and household tasks. I'm afraid I've done justice to neither. Eleanor turned to face him fully, her expression serious but kind. Mr. Mitchell, I see a property with excellent bones and unlimited potential. What it needs is systematic attention and someone who understands that a home requires as much care as the land that supports it. I believe we can remedy the current state of affairs quite effectively. Thomas felt something shift in his chest at her words. Not pity or feminine tact, but genuine assessment from someone who saw possibilities rather than problems. I'd be grateful for your help, Miss Hartwell. More grateful than you might realize. Eleanor's quarters occupied a small but well-built cabin about 50 yards from the main house, originally constructed for Sarah's mother during her final years. The space had been maintained better than the main house, with sturdy furniture and clean windows that looked out over the vegetable garden that had gone wild in the absence of tending hands. This is perfect, Eleanor declared, setting her carpetbag on the simple wooden table. Private but not isolated, close enough to the main house to be convenient for work. She moved to the window and gazed out at the overgrown garden, already envisioning neat rows of vegetables and herbs that would provide both sustenance and beauty. Thomas lingered in the doorway, suddenly uncertain about the propriety of being alone with her in what would be her private space. I'll leave you to get settled. Supper's usually around 6 if you'd like to join me in the main house. We can discuss your duties and work out the details of our arrangement. Eleanor nodded, then impulsively added, Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know that I understand the trust you're placing in me by bringing me here. I won't disappoint you. The sincerity in her voice seemed to surprise them both with its intensity. Thomas touched his hat brim and stepped back into the afternoon sunlight. Miss Hartwell, something tells me disappointment is the last thing I need to worry about where you're concerned. Eleanor spent the remainder of the afternoon exploring her new surroundings and making mental notes about immediate priorities. The main house revealed the full extent of Thomas's well-intentioned but inadequate housekeeping efforts. Dust lay thick on surfaces that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, windows were clouded with accumulated grime, and the kitchen showed signs of meals prepared by someone who viewed cooking as a necessary evil rather than a domestic art. But Eleanor also saw evidence of care in unexpected places. Thomas had kept Sarah's flower garden alive, though it struggled without expert tending. He'd maintained the basic cleanliness that prevented genuine squalor, even if he lacked the knowledge for thorough housekeeping. Most telling of all, he'd preserved Sarah's personal belongings not as a shrine, but as cherished memories, carefully dusted and lovingly maintained. When Eleanor knocked on the main house door at 6 o'clock, Thomas answered wearing his best shirt and an expression of nervous anticipation that touched her heart. Come in, Miss Hartwell. I'm afraid supper isn't much, biscuits and beans mostly, but you're welcome to share what I have. Eleanor surveyed the simple meal he'd prepared and felt a surge of protective instinct that surprised her with its strength. This man had been trying so hard to manage everything alone, maintaining his pride while slowly drowning in responsibilities that required different skills than those needed for ranch work. Mr. Mitchell, this looks perfectly adequate for tonight, she said, settling herself at the scarred wooden table. But beginning tomorrow, I'd like to take over meal preparation as part of my duties. I believe you'll find my cooking somewhat more varied than your current menu. Thomas served the simple food with careful attention to her comfort, and Eleanor found herself touched by his efforts to be hospitable despite his obvious inexperience with entertaining. They ate in companionable quiet at first, both adjusting to the novelty of sharing a meal with another person after extended periods of solitary dining. Miss Hartwell, Thomas said eventually, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. I feel I should explain something about my circumstances, so you understand what you've gotten yourself into. Eleanor waited patiently, recognizing his need to establish honesty between them from the beginning of their working relationship. I married Sarah when we were both 18, and she was the heart of this place for 15 years. When she died of the fever 3 years back, I thought I could just keep going like nothing had changed. But the truth is, she handled everything that made this a home instead of just a collection of buildings and livestock. His voice roughened slightly with emotion. I've been failing at it ever since, too proud to ask for help and too stubborn to admit I was drowning. Eleanor felt her heart contract with sympathy for his lonely struggle, but she kept her expression calm and professional. Mr. Mitchell, there's no shame in recognizing that different people possess different strengths. You've clearly maintained the ranch operation successfully, which requires considerable skill and dedication. Managing a household requires its own expertise, which I happen to possess. This is a practical arrangement that benefits us both. Thomas looked across the table at her with something approaching wonder. You have a way of making things sound simple, Miss Hartwell, even when they're complicated. Eleanor smiled, and Thomas felt his breath catch slightly at the transformation of her face. When she smiled genuinely, her entire being seemed to radiate warmth and intelligence in a way that made conventional notions of beauty seem suddenly irrelevant. Sometimes the complicated things are only complicated because we make them so, Mr. Mitchell. Good people helping each other shouldn't be complicated at all. They spent the next hour discussing practical matters, Eleanor's duties, compensation, schedules, and expectations. Thomas proved to be fair and reasonable in all his proposals, offering wages that were generous without being insulting and working conditions that respected her dignity while acknowledging the reality of frontier life. As Eleanor prepared to return to her cabin for the night, Thomas walked her to the door with old-fashioned courtesy that spoke of good upbringing despite his rough exterior. "Miss Hartwell, I want to thank you again for taking this position. I know the circumstances that brought you here weren't easy, but I hope you'll find this situation more to your liking than what you encountered in town." Eleanor paused at the threshold, looking back at him with an expression of quiet determination. "Mr. Mitchell, I believe we're both going to benefit from this arrangement more than either of us currently realizes. Good night." Thomas stood in his doorway long after Eleanor's cabin windows had glowed to life with lamplight, feeling something he'd almost forgotten, the peace that came from sharing his space with someone who understood that a home was more than shelter from the elements. Eleanor's first full day at the ranch began before dawn, as was her custom. She dressed quietly in her oldest work dress and made her way to the main house, where she found the kitchen cold and Thomas already gone to tend his livestock. The state of the kitchen in morning light revealed the full scope of the challenge ahead, but Eleanor felt energized rather than overwhelmed by the prospect of restoring order to chaos. She began with the most basic task, building a proper fire in the cookstove and setting water to heat for both cleaning and coffee. As the kitchen gradually warmed and filled with the comfortable sounds of domestic activity, Eleanor felt herself settling into the rhythm of purposeful work that had always brought her satisfaction. By the time Thomas returned from his morning chores, the kitchen had been transformed. Surfaces gleamed with proper cleaning, windows sparkled with clarity that revealed the beauty of the surrounding landscape, and the rich aroma of genuine coffee filled the air along with the promise of breakfast more substantial than yesterday's meager fare. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," Eleanor called cheerfully from the stove, where she was turning bacon with practiced efficiency. "I hope you're hungry, because I believe in starting the day with a proper meal." Thomas stood in his own doorway, momentarily stunned by the transformation not just of his kitchen, but of the entire atmosphere of his home. The space felt alive again in a way it hadn't since Sarah's death, filled with purpose and care that went beyond mere cleanliness to touch something deeper about what made a house into a home. "Miss Hartwell, I hardly recognize the place," he said, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door. "It smells like—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound foolish or overly sentimental. "Like a home," Eleanor suggested gently, understanding the emotion behind his hesitation. "That's rather the point, isn't it? You've been living in a house, Mr. Mitchell, but what you need is a home. There's a significant difference between the two." Thomas accepted the plate she offered him. Eggs cooked just right, bacon crisp but not burned, biscuits that were actually light and fluffy, and felt something tight in his chest begin to relax for the first time in years. "Miss Hartwell, if this is what you consider a normal breakfast, I may never let you leave this ranch." Eleanor's cheeks pinked slightly at the compliment, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "I'm pleased you approve, Mr. Mitchell. A good breakfast sets the tone for the entire day, and I believe in approaching each day with proper preparation." They ate together in comfortable silence, both adjusting to the novelty of beginning the day with companionship rather than solitary contemplation of approaching tasks. Thomas found himself studying Eleanor as she ate, noting the unconscious grace with which she moved, the way she seemed to bring order to everything she touched without apparent effort. "Miss Hartwell," he said eventually, "I'm curious about your background. You mentioned experience organizing charitable work in Boston. Were you in domestic service there?" Eleanor set down her coffee cup and considered how much of her history to share. "Not domestic service exactly, Mr. Mitchell. My father was a merchant, reasonably successful until his death 5 years ago. I managed his household and helped with his business affairs, which gave me experience in both domestic and commercial organization. After he passed, I lived with my aunt until her death last year, helping to care for her during her final illness." Thomas heard the careful omissions in her account, the gradual loss of financial security, the shrinking circumstances that had eventually led a respectable merchant's daughter to seek marriage with a stranger 1,500 miles from home. But he also heard strength and practical capability that explained her competence in transforming his chaotic household. "That explains your efficiency," he said simply. "You've had practice managing complex situations under difficult circumstances." Eleanor felt a warm flutter of appreciation for his understanding. Most people, upon learning of her reduced circumstances, either offered unwanted pity or made assumptions about her character that reflected their own prejudices rather than her actual situation. Thomas simply accepted her information and drew reasonable conclusions about her capabilities. "Experience teaches us what we're capable of, doesn't it?" she replied. "I've learned that I'm quite good at creating order from chaos and finding beauty in situations that others might consider hopeless." Thomas felt the truth of her words resonate in his chest. She had indeed found beauty in his chaotic situation, transforming not just his physical surroundings but his sense of possibility about the future. "Miss Hartwell, I think this ranch is very fortunate that Samuel Garrett was fool enough to reject you." Eleanor's face blazed with sudden color, but her eyes sparkled with something that might have been humor. Mr. Mitchell, I believe that's the first time anyone has suggested my rejection was someone else's loss rather than my personal failure. Thank you for that perspective. The days that followed established a rhythm that benefited both of them in ways neither had entirely anticipated. Eleanor attacked the accumulated neglect of the household with systematic determination, but she also brought something less tangible, a sense of purpose and care that transformed the ranch from a place of mere survival into something approaching prosperity. She organized Thomas's scattered business records, revealing that his ranch was actually more successful than his haphazard bookkeeping had indicated. She established routines for cleaning and maintenance that prevented small problems from becoming major disasters. Most importantly, she created an atmosphere of comfort and order that allowed Thomas to focus his energy on the work he did best rather than struggling with tasks for which he had neither aptitude nor training. Thomas, for his part, proved to be an ideal employer in ways that Eleanor had not dared to hope for when she accepted his offer. He treated her with consistent respect and consideration, never presuming on their working relationship or making her feel that her position was precarious. He listened to her suggestions about improving the ranch operations and implemented her ideas with gratitude rather than wounded masculine pride. More surprisingly, he seemed to genuinely value her company during the quiet evening hours when the day's work was finished. They fell into the habit of sharing supper and then lingering over coffee while discussing everything from practical ranch matters to books they had read, dreams they harbored, and observations about the changing seasons. Eleanor discovered that Thomas possessed depths of thought and feeling that his quiet manner concealed from casual observers. He read voraciously during the long winter evenings, had taught himself basic veterinary skills through careful observation and study, and maintained a correspondence with agricultural colleges that kept him informed about new farming techniques and livestock management practices. Thomas, meanwhile, found himself fascinated by Eleanor's quick intelligence and broad knowledge. Despite her reduced circumstances, she had received an excellent education and possessed a natural curiosity about the world that made their conversations intellectually stimulating in ways he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. More than that, she brought a perspective shaped by different experiences that challenged his assumptions and broadened his understanding of many subjects. As October settled over the ranch with its cargo of golden aspen leaves and crisp morning air, both Thomas and Eleanor began to realize that their arrangement had evolved beyond the simple employer-employee relationship they had originally envisioned. The line between professional courtesy and personal affection had blurred so gradually that neither could pinpoint exactly when the change had occurred. Eleanor found herself looking forward to Thomas's return from his daily work with an anticipation that had nothing to do with professional duty and everything to do with genuine pleasure in his company. She caught herself taking extra care with her appearance on days when they planned to work together on projects that required close collaboration. Most tellingly, she had begun to think of the ranch not as her temporary workplace but as home in a way that surprised her with its intensity. Thomas experienced his own moments of recognition that his feelings had grown beyond appropriate bounds for an employer. He found himself manufacturing reasons to spend time in Eleanor's vicinity, seeking her opinion on matters he could have easily decided himself, and feeling genuinely disappointed on the rare occasions when her duties kept her occupied in parts of the ranch where he couldn't easily encounter her. The crisis that forced them both to acknowledge their changing relationship arrived with the first serious storm of the approaching winter. Eleanor woke in her cabin to the sound of wind howling like a living thing and snow pelting against her windows with the force of thrown sand. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees overnight, transforming the mild autumn evening into a winter emergency that caught both the ranch and its inhabitants unprepared. Eleanor dressed quickly and struggled through the whipping snow to the main house, where she found Thomas already awake and pulling on his heaviest coat. "The cattle," he shouted over the storm's roar. "They're in the north pasture without shelter. If I don't get them moved to the lower fields, we'll lose half the herd by morning." Eleanor felt her heart contract with fear, not for the livestock, but for Thomas himself. The storm was vicious enough to disorient even experienced outdoorsmen, and the north pasture was miles from the ranch buildings across terrain that could become treacherous in blizzard conditions. "You can't go alone in this weather," she protested. "It's too dangerous." Thomas paused in the midst of gathering emergency supplies, touched by her concern but determined to protect his livelihood. "I don't have a choice, Eleanor. Those cattle represent everything I've worked for. If I lose them, I lose the ranch." The use of her first name, spoken unconsciously in his urgency, sent a thrill through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with the intimacy it implied. But her fear for his safety overrode any pleasure in the slip of formality. "Then I'm coming with you," she declared, reaching for her heaviest cloak. "You'll need someone to help manage the cattle, and I won't sit here wondering if you're lying frozen in some gully." Thomas turned to stare at her, torn between admiration for her courage and horror at the thought of endangering her life. "Eleanor, you don't understand. This isn't just uncomfortable weather, this is genuinely dangerous. I can't risk your safety." Eleanor met his gaze with determination that brooked no argument. "Thomas, you don't understand. I'm not a fragile flower who wilts at the first sign of hardship. I grew up helping my father with his business, which included loading and moving freight in all kinds of weather. I'm stronger than I look, and you need help more than you need to protect my delicate sensibilities." The sound of her using his first name, combined with the fierce loyalty in her voice, nearly undid Thomas's resolve to face the storm alone. But Eleanor was already bundling herself into her warmest clothes and gathering supplies with the efficiency of someone accustomed to meeting emergencies heat-in. "If you're determined to do this fool thing," she continued, pulling on her sturdiest boots, "at least let me increase your chances of survival by coming along. Two people have a better chance than one of making it through this storm, and you know it." Thomas realized that arguing with Eleanor in full determination was like trying to negotiate with a blizzard, impressive to witness, but ultimately futile. Instead, he focused on practical preparations, ensuring that she was as well equipped as possible for the dangerous journey ahead. They set out into the storm together, leaning into wind that tried to push them backward with every step. The familiar landscape of the ranch had been transformed into an alien world of whirling white chaos, where landmarks disappeared and direction became a matter of faith rather than sight. Thomas led the way, following instincts developed through years of working the land, while Eleanor stayed close behind him, her presence both reassuring and terrifying as he contemplated the responsibility of keeping them both alive. The journey to the North Pasture took twice as long as usual, requiring frequent stops to rest and reorient themselves when the storm's fury threatened to overwhelm their progress. Eleanor proved her assertion about her strength and endurance, never complaining about the brutal conditions or asking to turn back despite the obvious danger they both faced. When they finally reached the cattle, they found the animals huddled against a rock outcropping, lowing with distress as snow accumulated around them in drifts that threatened to bury the smaller members of the herd. Thomas and Eleanor worked together to move the cattle toward the sheltered lower pasture, using techniques that required coordination and trust between them as they guided the frightened animals through terrain made treacherous by wind and snow. Eleanor's size, which had been the source of so much cruel judgment from others, proved to be an advantage in the storm. Her solid frame and strong hands enabled her to manage the cattle effectively, and her ability to maintain her footing in difficult conditions made her an invaluable partner in the dangerous rescue operation. By the time they successfully moved the herd to safety, both Thomas and Eleanor were exhausted, soaked through despite their heavy clothing, and chilled to the bone. The return trip to the ranch house became a test of endurance that pushed both of them to their physical limits, but also created a bond forged in shared struggle and mutual dependence. They stumbled through the kitchen door together, snow-covered and shaking with cold but triumphant in their success. Thomas immediately set about building up the fire while Eleanor struggled out of her wet clothes. Both of them moving with the automatic efficiency of people who understood that survival depended on taking care of immediate necessities before allowing themselves the luxury of celebrating their achievement. "Eleanor," Thomas said as they sat before the blazing fire, sharing coffee laced with whiskey to combat the lingering chill, "I owe you an apology. I underestimated both your capabilities and your courage. Without your help tonight, I would have lost the herd and probably my life as well." Eleanor looked at him across the space between their chairs, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since arriving at the ranch. His hair was tousled from the storm, his face marked with exhaustion and relief, his eyes holding an expression of gratitude mixed with something deeper that made her pulse quicken with recognition. "Thomas," she replied softly, "we saved the herd together. More importantly, we kept each other safe. I think that tells us something significant about what we've become to each other." Thomas set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his gaze searching her face with an intensity that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something that I probably should have said weeks ago. This arrangement we've made, employer and employee, it stopped being the truth sometime around the third day you were here." Eleanor felt her heart begin to beat more rapidly, but she kept her voice steady. "What truth would you prefer to acknowledge, Thomas?" Thomas rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the strength she had witnessed during their battle with the storm. "The truth that you brought this place back to life in ways that have nothing to do with clean kitchens and organized books. The truth that I look forward to seeing you every morning and dread the thought of you ever leaving. The truth that I've fallen in love with your strength, your kindness, your intelligence, and yes, your beauty, the real beauty that shines from inside you and makes everything else seem insignificant." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Thomas, the truth is that I stopped thinking of this as temporary employment weeks ago. This ranch feels more like home than anywhere I've ever lived, and you feel more like family than anyone I've ever known. I love you too. Your gentleness, your integrity, your quiet strength, and the way you see worth in people that others overlook." Thomas reached up to touch her face with one calloused finger, tracing the line of her cheek with reverent care. "Eleanor, I know I'm not much of a catch. I'm a widowed rancher with more debts than assets, living in the middle of nowhere with nothing much to offer except hard work and an uncertain future." Eleanor caught his hand and pressed it more firmly against her cheek, smiling through her tears. "Thomas, you're offering me everything I've ever wanted, a home, a purpose, and someone who values me for who I truly am rather than what I look like or what others expect me to be. That's not nothing, that's everything." Thomas felt his heart expand in his chest until he thought it might burst with the magnitude of his love for this remarkable woman who had transformed his life so completely. "Eleanor Hartwell, will you marry me? Will you stay here and help me build something good and lasting on this land? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you how precious you are?" Eleanor's answer came not in words, but in the way she leaned forward to kiss him, gentle and sure, with all the love and certainty she had been storing in her heart since the first moment he had treated her with dignity and respect. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his and whispered, "Yes to everything, Thomas Mitchell. Yes to all of it." The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small church at Copper Ridge, witnessed by a congregation that had come to recognize Eleanor's true worth through her continued kindness and practical help to anyone who needed it. Mrs. Henderson, her boarding house rebuilt with Eleanor's organizational assistance, insisted on providing the wedding cake. Big Jim McKenzie gave Eleanor away in place of the father she had lost, his gruff exterior unable to conceal his genuine affection for the woman who had brought such obvious happiness to his friend Thomas. Even Samuel Garrett attended, though he had the grace to look ashamed of his earlier behavior as he watched Eleanor walk down the aisle in a simple but elegant dress that she had sewn herself, her face radiant with joy and love. Eleanor and Thomas exchanged vows that they had written themselves, promising not just to love and honor each other but to continue building together the home and life they had already begun creating. Eleanor promised to bring her strength and love to their shared future, while Thomas promised to cherish and protect the precious gift of Eleanor's heart for all the days of his life. As they kissed to seal their marriage, the entire congregation erupted in applause and celebration, recognizing that they had witnessed not just a wedding, but the triumph of true love over superficial judgment and narrow-minded prejudice. Eleanor Hartwell had arrived in Copper Ridge as a rejected mail-order bride, dismissed as too chunky for love, but she was leaving the church as Eleanor Mitchell, beloved wife of a man who saw her true worth and cherished every generous inch of her heart. The reception continued late into the evening, filled with dancing, laughter, and the joy that comes from witnessing two people find perfect happiness in each other's arms. Eleanor danced with her new husband under the desert stars, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought her from rejection and loneliness to love and belonging. Thomas held his wife close, marveling at the miracle that had brought this extraordinary woman into his life just when he needed her most. As they prepared to leave for their ranch, their home, Eleanor paused to thank the people who had become her friends and neighbors, her voice strong and clear as she addressed the gathered crowd. "When I arrived in Copper Ridge, I thought I was looking for a husband. What I found instead was a community, a home, and a love that sees past surface appearances to value the heart beneath. Thank you all for teaching me that true worth isn't measured by others' opinions, but by the love we give and receive." Thomas and Eleanor drove home through the clear, cold night, her hand resting in his as their wagon wheels crunched through snow that sparkled like diamonds in the moonlight. The ranch buildings appeared ahead of them, warm light glowing from the windows of the house they would now share as husband and wife, promising years of love, partnership, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful together. Eleanor had arrived in the desert as a woman deemed too chunky for love, but she had discovered the truth that would sustain her for the rest of her days. The right person doesn't just accept your generous heart, they celebrate it, cherish it, and recognize it as the greatest treasure they could ever possess. In Thomas's arms, Eleanor had found not just love, but the recognition that she had always been exactly enough, exactly right, exactly perfect for the person wise enough to see her true beauty.